Hello, it's John Faithful Hamer at the Likeville podcast. Today I'm going to be talking with Genevieve Weynerowski, a writer who's just written a very interesting piece on the subject of privilege. So you say in your piece in Quillette that privilege is a concept that is no longer very useful. So why is that?
I don't want anybody to take away from the piece that I wrote that I don't understand that privilege exists. Clearly it does. It's a useful term in all kinds of ways, but I think that the way that it's being...
So how is it, before we even just go on, because I find this, I teach on this stuff. So why do you think it's a useful, before we talk about the problems with it, why do you think it's a useful concept?
It's a word that's been used for, I don't know, hundreds, I can't say for sure, 700, 912 years. To great effect. It's descriptive and it's useful. But, in the last couple of years, last few years, you see it deployed in all kinds of ways, usually as a slur or as part of an order or a command for somebody to, stop what they're doing, stop what they're thinking, stop what they're saying, and take an inventory of whatever privilege, so-called, in quotation marks, they're enjoying. And I'm not sure that this is a very effective thing to do.
I guess for me, the way that I try and explain what is positive about and what is useful about the concept when I'm teaching on the subject of privilege is I say it's sort of like lottery tickets. If you have a great deal of privilege, if you're born with a lot of opportunities, you're born very healthy in a wealthy household, and you have, whatever, all the various advantages, then it's sort of like being given, 1,000 lottery tickets or 10,000 lottery tickets. So your chances of winning and winning big are quite high, but it's still possible, given the way the numbers work, it's still possible to have a great deal of privilege and completely fail, right?
I think
and
that's
likewise,
key.
you can have almost no privilege and just end up with like one lottery ticket and win everything, right? So it increases the chances that you'll be successful, but it doesn't guarantee that you're successful.
It doesn't guarantee it by any means. And if you look at the way people move up and down, or collectively or individually, how they move up and down, say through the social classes,
yes.
Especially looking at North America, people can move from the working classes up to the super rich and back down again. I think it's more interesting to look at the individual rather than the collective, which I think opens up another conversation.
Well, you said that about, I thought that was really interesting about Margaret Atwood, that for people to say that somehow the only reason she has been successful in a highly unlikely field is just because of her privilege seems, you have to account for the fact that there's, tens of thousands of Margaret Atwoods that didn't make it and were not successful, right? So,
in defense of Margaret Atwood, they're probably not tens of thousands.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that's true. I think that obviously there are millions of people who are talented, who, have all kinds of potential that'll probably never be realized. Billions, if you look at the world as a whole. That's true, and it's a terrible reality. And I think that it's something that can be, I think it's something that needs to be addressed, that is being addressed in many, many, many different ways. There are, people have been trying to address inequities and injustice for the last several hundred years, particularly since the Enlightenment, when the focus has been on human individuals and human potentiality. And some of those ways work well, and some of them work less well. And obviously, we remain a world where there are a lot of poor people and a lot of people who will never get to be a Margaret Atwood, no matter how talented they are. That's for sure. And I think that it's interesting, or more interesting and more useful, to look at ways in which we can allow individuals with potential to actually realize it, rather than talk about the ways in which the people who have achieved success, especially in the arts, are somehow owe anything to anybody. I mean, we should be looking to them for inspiration. They can be aspirational. They're the very people who are going to give, inspiration and succor and all of that to the people who need it the most. I mean, I think that's the way it ought to be looked at. And then there's so many ways in which other ways in which people are privileged. You cannot, a tall person is privileged because, he or she can reach the top cupboard, and short people are privileged.
People, mentally healthy people, yeah.
Absolutely. And that's kind of a wonderful thing. Wouldn't it be great, sure, if every single person on earth was 6 feet tall, or if that's if that's the standard we're going to go for, and super brilliant, and we're able to do all those things. But that's not the world that we live in.
Yeah. There's a wonderful scene in the book by J.D. Vance, Hillbilly Elegy.
I just read that.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, when he talks about going to Yale, and here he comes from this completely fucked up background and this very dysfunctional, as he just, hillbilly, white trash, kind of, his mother has serious addiction problems. He has, horrible situation. And he goes to Yale, and he has people telling him in seminars that he needs to check his privilege.
Yeah.
And he's like, what?
The irony.
And people who have gone to the best private schools and who've had, every single advantage are telling him, just because of the fact that he's a straight white male, that he needs to check his privilege, which is, it's clearly
head spinning for him at the time.
Yeah, at the time, it's completely. And there's that wonderful scene, since you just read it, you probably remember, where they all go out and they eat a lot of food at this like fast food place, and it's late at night, and they've been out drinking, and then everybody leaves, and they leave this massive mess.
Yeah.
That the woman working there, the waitress, is gonna have to clean up, right? And he stays back with this other like African American student, and the two of them spend a whole bunch of time cleaning up the mess before they leave. And they have this like moment of recognition where they realize that they're the only two of all these Yale law students who thought about that.
Yeah.
And the other guy says to him, he's like, yeah, because I think these are people who've had other people clean up their messes for their whole lives.
For
right?
sure. Yeah.
So, that I think is one of the problems with the notion, as you say, one of the problems with privilege. Now, there are people who say that the whole theory of intersectionality is supposed to correct for these problems by including things like whether you're good looking, or including things like class, including things, like mental health and physical health and ableism and all that stuff. What do you think about, do you think intersectionality sort of salvages the notion of privilege and makes it more useful?
I don't at all.
So
I actually think it just slices and dices people up even more into ever more arcane and fanciful categories. I really do. And I mean, if you take it to its logical conclusion, you still arrive back at the individual, which is the person which is who we should be looking at. But I don't think that's the aim of intersectionality. What I see happening with kind of the culture wars on the left right now is this sort of constant attempt to refine and redefine categories of people that become, as I say, I mean, if you pursue them to their logical conclusion, become ever smaller and more unuseful. So yeah, I don't really buy intersectionality.
Yeah, I'm equally. I'm sort of. I mean, I saw that when I was in graduate school. I remember it was in seminars. It was very often this kind of crazy, almost like the Hunger Games. We were like trying to sort of tear each other apart in this oppression Olympics, and I noticed like some patterns which were really sort of disturbing to me. And although I participated in them completely and until I realized it, but I noticed that the women in the seminar, the white women in the seminar especially, would always try and bring the discussion around to a discussion of gender. And people like myself, who grew up poor, my mother was on welfare until I was 14, and we were quite poor, and we went to food banks and things like that. So guys like me would always try and steer the discussion towards class, and then people of color would try and very often sort of steer the conversation towards race, and then
well, it sets you up for competition for who's.
And it just became very suspicious to me that we were all trying to shift things onto the ground where we felt like we would have superiority, where we would have an angle on somebody else, which is really, really. I realize it's so perverse at a certain point.
Seems kind of counterproductive.
Well, yeah, I mean, because you're defining yourself based on what has happened to you rather than what the world has done to you rather than what you've done in the world, right? Which is becomes,
And then the question too becomes, what do you gain once you've, achieved your niche, once you've defined it? What does society have to gain by that? And what do you as an individual have to gain by that?
Well, I think the argument would be that what you gain is epistemic privilege. So you gain the right to be able to speak on certain matters. So you have the authority to speak on certain matters, and people have to shut up when you're talking about. Now, to some extent, I get this, right? I get this, and I get this from former students of mine who are police officers. I hear this from them. I hear this from my friends who are doctors. They'll say, well, you can't judge my job until you have been a police officer. You don't know how hard my job is, and until you've actually walked in my shoes. And then you have politicians who say, you can't judge my job until you've walked in my shoes, or diplomats. My friend is a diplomat right now, and he's said the same thing. And so clearly there's some truth to it, right? That in doing something, you often have certain privilege, or being situated in a certain way, you see things that other people don't see.
Of course, but that's
it
a
has a
truism.
way, but it has a way of like shutting down all discussion. So where you just say, well, you're not allowed to talk about my parenting unless you're a parent yourself. Well, no. I mean, if you see me like hitting my kids in the park, I think it makes sense for you to say, I don't think you should be hitting the baby humans. Like, so that's right. But it is very much this way of like shutting down all discussion and just making people listen to you, right?
So that might work around a dinner table or in a seminar, maybe, although I don't know if you'd be invited back, maybe to the seminar, probably not to the dinner.
Mm-hmm.
I think that as a society, we have to be able to evaluate and judge and understand as much as possible all of the different, all the different realities that people bring to the table. That's the only way to get anything done. But there are people who have to be able to evaluate that and then make policy. There are people who have to, police officers who have to make decisions in the moment. I mean, there's so many ways in which you can't step back and say, right, well, in my case, I'm a white middle class woman, so I'm just going to abscond. I mean, you can't do that. And that's not how society functions. I mean, really, I think that we should all, it's kind of, this like hoary old Enlightenment idea, but I think that we should be looking for ways in which we can better talk to each other rather than shutting each other out. I just don't see how there can possibly be a positive end game.
Yeah. No, it's interesting that you talk about the Enlightenment, because obviously one of the central arguments of the Enlightenment was that we all have reason and we have language. And so if we try and speak as clearly as possible and sort of stay away from any kind of obfuscation and any kind of jargon and things like that, if we try and speak as clearly as possible, then people have a capacity for reason. And everybody has a capacity for reason, which, by the way, for the Enlightenment, that was a very radical idea. Because, I mean, if you go to like ancient Greece, for instance, Aristotle and many other ancient Greek philosophers, they thought that only men had a capacity for reason, right? And even often they would say only certain kinds of men too, right? So it was a small subset of the human population that had a capacity for reason, and everybody else was cut out, right? So you get in the Western tradition at least, you get with the Stoics and with the Epicureans, the Hellenistic philosophers, they were the first ones to put forward the idea that everybody has a capacity for reason. But it didn't really take off until the Enlightenment, right? And what's interesting is the whole discourse around privilege. One of the things that I agree with you, you point this out in your article, one of the things that's very corrosive about it is that it actually implicitly says that we are sealed off from each other and we can't actually communicate, that there are these barriers, right? And we can't get over them.
Well, as you were saying, the idea is that you can't possibly understand where I'm coming from. Have you not, if you haven't walked in my shoes or had my experiences. And the thing is, again, first of all, everybody has the right to describe their experience. Others have the right to listen, and probably the obligation and the duty to listen and to try to understand. And then from there, I mean, that's the only way forward, to say, well, you can't possibly understand and therefore you have to stop talking. Again, yeah, it just shutting people down just doesn't really work.
Yeah. Well, and
having said that, I mean, I would say, obviously there are easy critiques to make about this, appeal to humanism or to humanistic principles coming out of the Enlightenment. I mean, Britain's empire took off in the 19th century. They were, oppressing and colonizing people all over the world, people who were did not have access to the public square in a way that they could make themselves heard. That's clear, and that's ongoing, and we see that all over the world. So when I say that I think that we should adhere to humanist principles, I say that knowing full well that we haven't achieved that there are a whole lot of people around the world who don't feel like that applies to them in any obvious way. And that needs to be addressed. But I just don't think that identity politics, privilege checking, and that sort of thing are the way to go.
Yeah. It's one interesting thing about, you were talking about the Enlightenment, and that I've always found is that there was this switch that happened. I don't know, I guess if I had to make a watershed, I would say the French Revolution, but obviously it happened in different places at different. But in the Ancien regime, there was this thing where people who were very ambitious, who wanted to get ahead in the world, who came from a lower station of life, let's say they were born out of wedlock, they were considered by the law bastards, like myself. I was born out of wedlock, so I'm actually considered a bastard, which has some strange side effects. Like when my wife and I got married in Massachusetts, they still have this law in the books from hundreds of years ago, where if one of the people getting married is a bastard, then your marriage records are sealed. And in order to get a copy of them, you have to go and stand before a judge. And the reason is, back in the day, if you wanted to destroy somebody's political reputation or their reputation in business or anything, all you had to do is get proof that they were a bastard, and that would completely discredit them, right? So anyway, so back in the day, what people would do if they were born as a slave or a servant or a serf or out of wedlock, they would pay money. And I mean, Versailles actually institutionalized this to an unprecedented extent, where you could go and buy a title, right? You would go and pay a certain amount of money. They would invent a fake privileged lineage for you, and you would be the Duke of, whatever, Mile End, right? You'd be the Duchess of the Plateau or something like that. They would invent this whole history, and you'd pay for it, right? And so this was the standard thing to do. So people were inventing privileged lineages because coming from an underprivileged background was a source of shame, right? Well, what's really fascinating is in our present strange environment, you have people like Rachel Dolezal who are pretending to come from an underprivileged background. You have people like George W. Bush's brother. What's the one in Florida?
Jeb.
Jeb saying, "I'm a self-made man." Right. This is somebody who's born into one of the most powerful families in the United States.
In fairness, that's always been important to the Americans, that myth of the self-made man. So,
oh yeah, yeah. But the myth of the self-made man is in a sense is trying to say like, I made this. I didn't. Right. Yeah. I didn't have this all handed to me.
Privilege.
I didn't have, and that's why Donald Trump feels the need to say like, I just got a small loan of $1 million. That's all. Like my father,
or 10 or 100.
Yeah, my father didn't help me at all. I did this all myself. Right. Yeah. So in that, regardless of whether it's true or not, what's fascinating is now people try really hard to, in certain circles, to stress the presence. Right. Like I have a friend who actually went through rather elaborate paperwork and a lot of like lawyers' fees and a lot of things to get status, sort of Indigenous status in Canada. And
to what end?
Because it makes certain grants available and it makes various kinds of things possible. But this is somebody who doesn't have any actual ties. This is a very distant ancestor. This person has no ties whatsoever.
Wasn't Joseph Boyd, was it?
No. But, regardless of it, the point being is that if you're an ambitious person, I'm not really necessarily judging it one way or the other. I just find it fascinating that if you're an ambitious person who wants to get ahead, the way to go in this day and age is exactly the inverse of what it used to be. So now you actually downplay the significance of your privileged ancestors and stress the importance of like your underprivileged ancestors.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I wonder with some of these things, how many people in North America are really affected by these ideas? So, people in the academy, sort of upper middle class people are kind of talking about this. You see a lot on social media and people are sort of, debating these ideas, including myself. But I sometimes wonder, out there in the real world, does anybody care? But I mean, I think about that and I think, well, probably to some degree. And I think that, I'm not the first person to say this, but, the Trump phenomenon, right? The sort of, when he was talking about political correctness, that really struck a chord, for better or for worse, with a lot of people. So I guess it is filtering out there into the sort of general consciousness. Whether it's really affecting them in their daily lives, I'm not sure, but it's a set of issues that has a lot of legs that people are sort of very for, very against. And certainly out there in social media land and in government, right? We see it a lot here in Canada now too with the Liberal Party. I mean, it is beginning to affect policy and so it will affect people's real lives. Anyway.
Yeah, I guess it definitely varies from sector to sector, but I think it's a mistake to see this as being just something that happens on the sort of the progressive left, because I mean, as you mentioned in your piece, this is something that happens on the right as well. There's this attempt to sort of show, hey, I'm every man, I'm the politician you want to have a beer with. I'm very down to earth. That's like, so this is something that is quite ingrained in American culture, and because American culture has largely become global culture, it's sort of filtering to everywhere else. But yeah, so I don't think it's just on the progressive left. I mean, you see
agree.
like Malcolm Gladwell. I was listening to one of his podcasts the other day, and he was talking about how startups, there's this mythology of startups, and it's always that, we started off in a back room in my apartment, and then we like blew up, and he says actually the real story of most startups is you were working at some big company like IBM, and you developed an idea and you stole some intellectual property from a big corporation and then you went off and right. So you didn't actually, it wasn't just David and Goliath all the way. You didn't start with nothing, Right, so right. I think this is the idea of rags to riches, that it's something that is actually very ingrained in
that aspect of it, for sure.
In American culture. And so to that extent, this obsession with privilege is not so much a brand new thing, but it's a new, perhaps especially malignant manifestation of something that's been around for quite a while.
Well, and it has, and it manifests itself somewhat differently on the left and on the right,
yes.
As I talked about in the piece as well. But yeah, on the left, I think it's being used to sort of reproach people. I mean, I understand where they're coming from. They want everybody, the left wants social justice for everybody, and those are laudable, it's a laudable goal. I think that they're not going about it in the best way, particularly because that kind of, the note of grievance that's, that these commands to check your privilege and that sort of thing, it's a real turnoff, and it alienates people. And we're seeing that. I mean, we are seeing, the rise of the alt-right, Donald Trump, who I personally cannot stand. Like, it still, to this day, upsets me.
I remember a few years ago you wrote a blog post about him, how you were just like, you said Donald Trump
could win.
I remember that. And you were talking about, if I remember correctly, you were talking about how there had been like the terrorist attacks, and there had been, it's been a while since I read it, but you were talking about how there was a running route for the Navy or something like that, and they found a bomb. And anyway, there had been a bunch of terrorist things. You said this was all going to play well for him, but
yeah.
But anyway, you were saying
and anyway, so on the left, it is kind of grievance politics. I think that they're selling their message really badly, and I do think that there's there's the equal and opposite reaction on the right. And I'm actually much more worried about what it's doing on the right and the way in which it's upending all of the social justice ambitions of people on the left, or on the center left. So yeah, I think it's ultimately it's not productive. It's counterproductive. I think it's giving rise to some really sort of nasty, angry, not very nice talk on the right, which itself, given that it's got currency in social media, it amplifies, it gets, ever more weird, ever more ugly. So anyway, I just think that the conversation needs to change, and that we need to sort of not so much come up with new terms, but new ways to frame these debates, ways that are less antagonistic, that are more inclusive, that bring people together. And that's it.
So how would you imagine that we would do that? I mean, okay, I'll frame it this way, that it's always seemed to me that identity politics, from a strategic standpoint, movement politics, that identity politics makes sense if you are the majority. So if you're trying to mobilize a silent majority, so let's say I'm like Nelson Mandela in South Africa, right? Or I'm René Lévesque here in Quebec, and I'm trying to sort of rouse a silent majority. So numerically, this group is kind of, they are the biggest group. So it makes sense to me in that, I'm not saying it's necessarily a good idea, but identity politics strategically makes sense in that standpoint, because if you arouse the masses, then they can, through democratic elections or through force, they can get power. But it seems to me when you're trying to mobilize a minority by identity politics, it seems like it's very counterproductive, because the more that they shout about how they are really identifying with their particular group, the more they, the majority or people outside of it are going to say, well, fine, if you don't feel any connection and any loyalty to like our larger group called, Quebec or Canada or the United States or Christendom or like Islam, if you don't have any loyalty to this larger tribe that we're trying to work out, then why should I do anything for you?
There's somebody who talks really interestingly about that. He's an African-American economist named Glenn Lowry. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He teaches at Brown University. He's a professor emeritus a million times. He's written several books. He's quite wonderful. He's about 70. He actually has a podcast as well, or sort of it's on Blogging Heads TV. Anyway, he was born and raised in Chicago, had a really crazy, really difficult upbringing in many ways. He had 3 kids by the time he was 19 or 20 or something like that. Worked in a printing plant for 5 years, and then finally went to college. And from there, he went to Northwestern, and from there to Harvard, where I think he quickly became a professor and started publishing and all. Anyway, why did I just give you his background? Oh, so he has interesting things to say about things like Black Lives Matter. So he does not like Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example. He doesn't appreciate what he's trying to do. Anyway, that's a sort of a separate story. But Glenn Lowry really thinks that he knows as well as anybody else what the problems are among underserved, disadvantaged Black people in the United States. And he really feels like the way they have to frame their needs and their problems is as part of the larger polity, and to include sort of underserved, the hillbilly LG people, the Kentucky, Ohio, Illinois, poor white people who are also facing not exactly the same problems across the board, but many of the same ones, in order to mobilize political action and to get the larger population to really pay attention and understand and get it and not feel alienated, but instead view it through this, this more inclusive lens.
Yeah. Well, that's very often the best way to do it. If people have some connection, if you can find like common ground, if people say we are all like Montrealers, or we are all New Yorkers, like after September 11th, I remember lots of people saying, we're all New Yorkers, and this feeling of solidarity, right? Or we are all Canadians? Are we all Quebecers or Americans? If you can find like some common ground, then that is a very, very powerful way to sort of inspire people to be more altruistic. I mean, if you look at this, one of the classic examples of this, I think, would be Christianity, right? When Christianity was first spreading, at the time, the Roman Empire was, starting to fall apart in many ways. And it was social services were not as good anymore. And very quickly, the network of churches became a social safety net, right? So there are the wealthy churches, the wealthiest church in Rome. That's how the bishop in Rome became the pope eventually, and became the most influential. It mainly was money, right? Because the Roman church had the most money, but they would do the equivalent of what we would think of in Canada as transfer payments to these poorer churches in the East and stuff like that. They would send money to them, and this was based on this common identity that, as Paul says, we are in Christ Jesus. There is neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. We are all one in Christ Jesus. So this kind of universalist vision became a framework for a lot of very altruistic action, right? And that's there's been many other examples. Islam is a fantastic example of that as well. And then nationalism and patriotism at their best, when they're not causing world wars and being terrible, at their best, they do the same thing, right? So it seems to me that the worst possible thing, if you're trying to get people to behave more cooperatively and to share their toys more effectively, the worst thing to do is to say we have no commonality. You're over there, I'm over here, because at that point, well, then there's only one way to figure things out, and it's with guns and knives and physical
we either kill
force.
each other or never speak again.
It's the war of my tribe against yours. And so if you're ready to do that, if you're ready to go to physical force, then I guess then
you better know what you're getting yourself into.
Exactly, you better know what you're getting into. And but if you don't, and I think the vast majority of progressives don't, but I don't think they realize that this kind of martial language has consequences.
Manning the barricades. And
if you use this really, really violent language and you're not ready to actually back it up with anything, I mean, that's really...
You're just going to end up with a bunch of enemies that you're not prepared for.
Yeah, right. And I have... I don't know if you've been watching Homeland. Do you watch that show?
Yeah, I've watched it.
I've kind of obsessed with it lately, but it's very fascinating because right now in this season, spoiler alert, if you're don't listen to this part of the podcast, but they're in this part of the season, the episode that just aired on Sunday night, they have this character on there that's very clearly a thinly veiled Alex Jones, like from InfoWars, right? And he whips people up into a frenzy.
I've seen those episodes.
Okay, you've seen them? Okay. And he's actually a complete phony. Like he's always talking about gun rights and the importance of, he's never shot a gun in his life. He doesn't know, and you see that when he gets onto it with all those like people who are the survivalists and the white nationalists and stuff like that. He doesn't know what he's talking about at all, right? And yet the consequences of him whipping people up into a frenzy are terrible, right? And I think there's people like that right now on the right and the left who are irresponsibly whipping people up into a frenzy. And I don't think they have any idea what they're getting into. I don't think they realize...
I think the ones on the right do, honestly.
You think
I
so?
think the Alex Jones people, I think so.
You think they're actually ready for that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the, guys like that, the Rush Limbaugh and people like that, I mean, they know what they're doing. They have been, Rush Limbaugh has been whipping people up for, 30 years. He's been able to see the effect that's had politically, and the way it's divided the country. I mean,
I guess
if after many decades they don't get
I'm not totally sure, because if you look at some examples, there are some examples where I would agree with you. They do seem to be very much prepared for the real thing. But I've also seen like a bunch of examples. What was that in Oregon, that standoff between the ranchers and things
That was
like
a very
that.
local thing, though.
And they were talking really, really tough. Like they're, we're going to go up against the government. They didn't even prepare enough food and water.
No, but that was just some backward clan of yokels.
They were not at all prepared. Like I remember when the Oka crisis happened here in Montreal, like I grew up like across the St. Lawrence River from a lot of from Mohawks, and I went to school with them in LaSalle and stuff like that. They were completely prepared. Like they had huge stockpiles of weapons, ammunition, food. They knew what they were getting into when they said, you actually build this golf course on our land, we'll take it to physical force. They were completely ready for what that would mean, and they knew what it would mean. I find my impression, maybe you're right. Maybe on the right they are more serious, but on the left I find there's a real kind of not understanding what you're actually saying and doing. Right. And I have this expression that I've sort of coined for people like this. We talk about like chicken hawks, they sort of the type of like right-wing militaristic conservative who's rah, 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 let's go invade countries, but has never actually fought in any wars and avoided the draft and makes sure that their kids don't go to war and all that stuff. Well, I have this term for people like that on the left, the revolution hawks, right? And they're people who constantly are rah, 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 revolution violence, and they advocate revolutionary violence, but they themselves have had no experience of revolution or violence.
They're probably fey coffee drinkers down the street.
They have no idea how ugly and how terrible these things can get, right? So how do we get past this to a more kind of civil discourse where we can get things done and make the world a better place?
Well, interestingly, along with the rise of all of this madness of the last couple of years, I mean, there's just been so much stuff. It feels like since 2016, it's been nonstop crazy. But at the same time, there's been a rise of, these really thoughtful people having long conversations on podcasts and mostly, on YouTube. People like Sam Harris, who is a huge inspiration to me and who's actually introduced me to so many interesting thinkers, but he's not alone. And I think that it's really taking off because you see more and more of that, these sort of long format discussions, conversations between people, often even people who don't agree on everything, and they kind of hash it out in a really civilized way. And I think that's sort of new in the public media. I mean, that's something that, I don't know, maybe back in the 60s, occasionally you'd have, what was his name? Buckley.
William F. Buckley.
Going up against Gore Vidal or whatever. But even that it was often quite confrontational, and, but I mean, last several decades, no, it's sound bites, it's people looking for the last word, it's 15-second clips of people making fools of themselves or rousing their people. So haven't you noticed that?
No, I have noticed that, and it's interesting because
there's such a hunger for it, right?
Sebastian Furtado, the producer of this podcast, we were talking about this just actually before you arrived. We were talking about how the intellectual dark web and how it's very, in a way, I see some parallels to J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, right? Like when Harry Potter came out, as you may or may not know, she shopped that manuscript around to numerous publishers. She got some very, very nasty rejection letters, and she wrote, I think it was in the New York Times, there was an op-ed where she talked all about all of the rejection letters she got, and she named names and had included really patronizing quotes from editors and stuff like that. It was amazing. But one of the main things she got again and again was, they said, kids these days, these are actual publishers at major houses, said, kids these days are stupid idiots that have no attention span. Your book is way too long. You have to, the only way they play video games, they have no attention span. Oh, by the way, no little boy is going to read a book written by a woman, so you better, that's why she went with J.K. Rowling. You better conceal the fact that you're a woman. And they really nasty stuff.
I knew she got a lot of rejections. I didn't realize they were filled with this kind of stuff.
So she completely revolutionized the way a whole kind of generation of educators thought, because she proved that young people could actually read a very long novel, hundreds of pages, and could be a bestseller, which did not make any sense. Like, it went totally against the conventional wisdom. So what you say about, Sam Harris and other people like Joe Rogan and stuff
Goes
like
against
that,
the conventional wisdom
that,
in
that
the
people
media.
don't have. You have to make everything really snappy into a Twitter, into a tweet, or into like make this 15 minutes and very punchy and very high energy, like
Shouting into the
breaking news, right? Like,
so and so
CNN,
demolished
right?
by.
And so having
Anderson
two
Cooper.
people in a calm fashion where they're not shouting over each other, where they're having like a conversation with each other, talking for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, that should not work.
It shouldn't work.
And yet people are doing it, right? And in a way, Jordan Peterson is also an example of
Although he's
this.
not the quietest person.
No, he's not.
So
but
impassioned.
but I mean, the first time I had students who were really into Jordan Peterson, and so I said, well, I should go check him out. And his voice just drove me insane. I couldn't stand like that squeaky and the Canadian accent. I just couldn't stand it. So I couldn't get through it. And I thought, how are people listening to dozens and dozens of hours of long talks that are the opposite of like
19 and they're
snappy, like quick cuts and
long talks about the Old Testament and taking responsibility for yourself.
And he's finding the very same people who supposedly didn't have the attention span for J.K. Rowling, for Harry Potter, supposedly don't have the attention span for a long Jordan Peterson lecture. And guess what they do, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And they also have the attention span for Joe Rogan like podcasts, which can be like 2-3 hours long. That guy's a beast. Like, they can just go on and rambling, and people really like it, right? So yeah, I think you're right. Maybe there's, at the same time, in the midst of this very polarizing environment, there are people on either end that are just saying like, fuck it, I don't like this anymore. I want to have like
who are
a
quite
civil
self-consciously doing this, which I think is great. And who are doing this, and they have millions of followers. I mean, it's unbelievable. The views on these videos and on like Sam Harris podcast, they can easily go 3 hours, but they're just so popular.
Yeah,
There's such a hunger for that.
Fascinating, and they're clearly not. He's not trying to be snappy or entertaining. It's not.
No, definitely not. He's a bit monotone and robotic.
But
I love him.
He sounds like, he's great, but he sounds like a very high functioning autistic man. So
on the spectrum.
He's like, got like, or neuroatypical. That's the PC term now. But yeah, he does seem like he's not like trying to emote a great deal, right? So that's very true. So you think that's part of the way that we get around it. But what do you do with, and we've seen this just in the last couple of days in your reactions to your piece in Quillette. There's people on either side that are going to want to claim it. How do you fight that?
You make it an ongoing. You don't necessarily have to fight it, I don't think. I think you just make it an ongoing conversation. If it's a one-off and, everybody feels like they've scored their own personal points, they've drawn from it what, buttresses whatever arguments they have. No, that's not great. I mean, there have been a few sort of more right-word leaning people who've commented on it. But I think most of the people are kind of somewhere in the center, and they appreciate that it's, it's a piece that I guess could be a little provocative to some people on the left, but in a nice way. It's more sort of about, let's talk about this. And then for the rest, for the people who are looking for fodder, I would just say, keep those conversations going. That's sort of what I'm trying to do on social media, and what I'm trying to do with my writing is, sometimes poke a little bit and say things that, might raise some eyebrows without actually having people fall into their fainting couches so that we can maintain the dialogue.
Well, it's, as I said in my sort of response to your piece, that as Margaret Atwood said in that much shared article, "Am I a Bad Feminist?" She says, in extreme times, people are pulled to the extremes, and moderates become sort of the most hated people, because they're like, oh, you're refusing to choose
Take a
side,
stand.
right? And so moderates end up being the worst kind of heretics.
Well,
right?
actually, I've actually seen that on Twitter. Saw some crazy rant. It was a long thread on Twitter. It was like 45 entries or something, where this guy was trying to make the argument that people in the center are the real fascists. I don't think he made his point all that well, but boy, did he ever try. So I guess that is a point of view. But I mean, I think that's kind of fringe. I don't think that the people in the middle are going to be pummeled out of existence. I think that people eventually will, what was the word I'm looking for? Will eventually sort of empty themselves of their ranting, and then they're going to want to know how to operate in the world as it is, and so they'll always be.
There's another thing I wanted to ask you about, which is the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Happiness Hypothesis, the Righteous Mind, why good people are divided by politics and religion, and his new book, which is coming out in a couple of months, The Coddling of the American Mind, which should be, I'm really looking forward to it. He says that there is one kind of interesting difference that he's found in his research between, and of course this is in the American context, between liberals, conservatives, and libertarians. And so the way the test goes, it goes something like this. They'll have a list of, let's say, like 100 questions, right? And they'll ask you, first of all, to identify what is your political leaning. So you say, well, I'm a liberal, and then sometimes he'll have a special category saying, are you very liberal, somewhat liberal, are you very conservative, somewhat conservative, very libertarian, somewhat. And then he says, okay, fill out this questionnaire. So they fill out the questionnaire. Then they give them the exact same questionnaire, and they say, how do you think so let's say, you're a conservative. You say, like, how do you think a liberal would answer this questionnaire? And so they answer it. And then they say, how do you think a libertarian would answer this questionnaire? And they fill it out. And he said there's a really, really marked difference. So conservatives, as it turns out, when you ask them to fill out the questionnaire the way a liberal would, they do really, really well. They have a high degree of accuracy.
They are able to identify how liberals think. They just can't relate.
They understand how liberals think. And so when you ask them to fill it out, they can do it. When you ask them to fill it out the way a libertarian would fill it out, they're very, very good at doing that as well. High degree of accuracy. Libertarians are even better. Libertarians are extremely good at knowing how liberals and conservatives think, right? The big outlier are liberals. Liberals, when they fill out the questionnaire, they're way off. They're way off. They basically think that you would look from the research, Haidt says, it looks like, and the more liberal you are...
Is it that they can't allow themselves to identify those
Well, this is
qualities?
what I wanted to sort of ask you, like, because this is something that's been tested many, many times and found the same result. Nobody's really sure why, right? There's theories, but liberals are big outliers when it comes to capacity for empathy with people, which is funny because liberals pride themselves on being really empathetic. But actually liberals are, in all these studies, they're terrible at empathy. They think all libertarians are sociopaths, and they think all conservatives are fascists, right?
Yeah.
Like theocrats. And they don't actually, and so this is a problem, I think, because if you want to, even once again, just from like a sort of a cold strategic standpoint, I go back to this often, unfortunately, but if you want to beat an opponent, whether it be in like a boxing match or a chess match or anything, if you want to beat somebody you're competing against another business or political party, you first have to know who they are, right? You have to watch, if you're going to be trained, I used to do martial arts, in fights and stuff like that. And you watch how somebody fights, you look for their weaknesses, their strengths, you pay attention to them. And the more you know how they fight, the more effective you'll be at fighting them. So in this respect, just from a purely strategic standpoint, liberals, and especially like far left progressives, liberals, they don't know their opponents very well at all.
Well, you saw the Facebook post that I wrote about having met
Yes.
a progressive candidate.
Okay, can you just
Well, I don't
recount
want to
that?
go. Yeah,
You don't have to give specifics, but I thought it was a really great
right.
story.
So I went to a fundraiser. I was invited by a friend who was hosting it to this fundraiser for a woman who wants to run for the parliament for the Liberal Party.
I think I know what you're talking about. Okay, yeah. I know what you're talking about. She's a good friend of mine. So
she was lovely.
Yeah,
she was really lovely. But it was a small group of people. It's March break, not that many people showed up. But anyhow, so she was sort of laying out some of her ideas, which I was, many of which I was really sympathetic to. But then, sort of talking about her approach to how she would deal with these things and the kinds of changes that she wants to make as a member of parliament. And there were quite a few progressive people around, and everybody was just cheering on everything that she was saying. I mean, absolutely uncritically, every idea was the greatest thing they'd ever heard. Anyhow, afterwards, she and I were chatting, and I sort of suggested that she might want to consider the fact that, some of these ideas are ultra progressive. I mean, they're not traditionally quite Liberal Party ideas. The Liberal Party is moving to the left and all that, but, these are kind of out there by Liberal Party standards, a party that tries to straddle kind of the right and the left. But more importantly, that, the Liberal Party has become quite progressive, and there is, in fact, a backlash. I mean, if you look at any of the comments section under, articles in the National Post or even the Globe and Mail or elsewhere, people are getting really, a lot of people out there are getting really tired of this relentless march toward progress, a progress that not everybody is necessary, or a vision of progress, which not everybody is necessarily bought into or are ready for, or that's necessarily going to be to their advantage. So I was just sort of talking about that with her a little bit and just saying, hey, I wasn't trying to tell her what to run on, but just to be aware that pushing a progressive agenda too far, or very far, might have certain unintended consequences. And she really looked at me with what I took to be surprise, real surprise. And this is a really intelligent woman.
Mm-hmm. She is.
Yeah. Without going into any detail about her background, but she's clearly somebody who,
she's one of the smartest people I know. And also one of the best people I know. She's a really good person.
She seems amazing. Yeah.
But no, that's very good advice. And unfortunately, this is a problem, right? In any walk of life, right? If you surround yourself with people who, and often it happens automatically. It's not even that you surround yourself with them, but if you're only surrounded with people who tell you what you want to hear and sort of like rah, 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 then you can, if you're not careful, you can end up as the emperor, with his new clothes. You can end up making this is how the Bush administration got into trouble with the invasion of Iraq, right? I mean, it was an evil, terrible idea from day one, but it also was really stupid because they invaded Iraq without an exit strategy. And the reason why they had no exit strategy is because they had a policy.
Convinced themselves that everything.
Well, it was also systematic. Anybody who said something they didn't want to hear was not invited to the meetings. So Colin Powell was just not invited to the planning meetings anymore because he was a real bummer. Right? He was saying stuff and the same thing if you read Barbara Ehrenreich's book, Bright-Sided, which is how positive thinking is ruining America and the world.
Of it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And she talks about how the positive thinking is behind so many problems in our society. And she talks about the mortgage crisis and how specifically people within the insurance industry and the banking industry who said there's a problem with what we're doing here, those people were sidelined, fired, not promoted.
Thinking negatively.
Yeah, they're like, the Tony Robbins types. They're like, you're just, not like living the dream, right? So those people, so it's good to have people like you around who can say like, hey, you might want to like think about this possibility. Like, hey, you've got lettuce between your teeth. There's a booger on your nose. Like somebody who very often a good friend and a good advisor is the person that will tell you things that you don't want to hear, right? And if you don't listen to those people,
Yeah, not everybody's wise enough to have a good friend around who will say no occasionally, though, right? Because I think that human impulse is to surround yourself with people who agree and who are going to sort of help you achieve that vision. So
it's hard to balance that, right? And I can understand, especially if you come from a situation where you felt very powerless and you've had like a rough time, you might especially want to surround yourself with cheerleaders, right? And I think that's what happens very often in certain kind of very, very political circles. You surround yourself with people who just like completely back up everything you say, right? And that just reinforces your position, right? And this, so I mean, but just to circle back for a minute, like, what would be your explanation? What would be your guess as to why there is this big difference between liberals, conservatives, and libertarians on ability to empathize with the other side?
Right. I mean, so the way you framed it earlier was liberals are not good at empathy. I mean, I'm not sure that's quite what it is. But specifically with other political points of view.
Yeah.
Because liberals are on the moral high ground, right? Why would they want to sully themselves? Why would they even want to stop and think and get into the minds of those evil sociopaths on the other side who are just trying to bring humanity down? You know, that would be crazy. Like, why waste time with that? Let's just, carry on in our forward march to perfection. Yeah, I think that they, liberals often do. They really do kind of want the best for the maximum number of people in a specific way. That's not to say conservatives don't. It's not to say libertarians don't. But liberals want to, do it now and do it in this sort of inclusive, hug everybody right now kind of way. I mean, it's often quite emotional as well. And so they assume that people who don't have that sense of kind of emotional, immediate need to help must be cold-hearted people. And, why, how could they possibly relate to that? So I think that's the assumption that's made.
Okay.
They just can't get out of that. And also Jonathan Haidt has some interesting things to say about sort of the about politics and religion and the way in which, certain political ideas also function like, or political movements function like religions. And I think liberalism can definitely work that way.
Especially in its progressive.
Especially in its progressive incarnation, because, there is this goal, there's this grand goal around which people, as he would say, can circle and band together. Yeah, so it's compelling.
I think that's. I also think something you were implying before. I think maybe has something to do with it. The whole idea of taboo boundaries, right? Mm-hmm. That like certain groups just erect taboo boundaries, which decide like I'm not going to even think about that, right? So I'm not even going to go there because it's dangerous just to even think that for a moment. So it could be, I think, for some people, because I've seen this when I've been talking to some of my progressive friends about like why, for instance, people in my family in the States, especially in the Rust Belt, why they voted for Donald Trump. And I try and explain to them, and there's just this absolute, this kind of resistance, anger. And it's exactly the kind of anger that I've encountered when you're trying to sort of talk about evidence for evolution to a creationist, a young earth creationist.
Or to talk about the fact that, trade maybe isn't such a terrible thing to a super left-wing anti-capitalist. They just, their heads explode.
Yeah, but there's this sense that like, I just don't want to hear what you're saying. Mm-hmm. And it's very aggressive. It's like, no, they voted for him because they're are racist. White supremacists. Mm-hmm. And they're misogynists and they're terrible and they're horrible. And I was like, well, maybe they have other reasons for doing it, but just the idea, like empathizing with somebody who might have a different opinion than you, that all by itself is seen as a way it sullies you. It's bizarre, right? So
and maybe that ties in with what we were talking about with respect to checking your privilege and not allowing certain people to speak, and only other special people with extra needs are allowed to take up space. I think that there's something there as well. I mean, it's divisive. It's, if you're a white straight man, middle class, then you are de facto the devil. It just, yeah. Maybe that was a little strong.
You're responsible for, I mean, that's one of the things.
Responsible for all the ills
yeah,
of the world.
I read Coates's book, and Between the World and Me, and I found, I really liked, quite a few of my friends don't like the language of it. I found the language really poetic and evocative and
He's
interesting.
a great writer.
Yeah, I liked
the ideas.
And there were things that I liked about the book a lot, but the thing that bugged me the most about the book was just this notion of group responsibility and
Collective
group rights. Because one of the things that I think is so great about the Enlightenment, about modernity, is getting rid of the idea of group responsibility. And we've said individuals are responsible for their, what they do and what they don't do.
Because group responsibility, collective responsibility, that cuts both ways. It can redound to your advantage, or it can really keep you down. I mean, ultimately, it's a losing game, I think. If you're going to go for collective responsibility from the progressive side, well, that can just be flipped right back on you, and has been. I mean, that's why a lot of people are still stranded.
Yeah. No, I mean, actually, the whole notion of collective responsibility has, in general, historically, has been responsible for really ugly stuff.
Exactly.
It's
exactly.
A lot of anti-Semitism in Europe was based on they killed our Lord. They crucified, and so we, like, Jews are collectively responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, which is totally insane on numerous levels. I mean, Jesus was Jewish, but anyway, but the notion of collective responsibility was also a key element of the pro-slavery argument in the South. Yeah. They argued that Africans were the descendants of Ham. Of Ham, yeah, exactly, right, who was punished by God for seeing his father's junk. Oh. And Noah was drunk in his tent, and women
kids were collectively responsible for Eve bringing knowledge into the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples, but generally speaking, the notion of collective responsibility has been a powerfully regressive force in the world. 100%. It's not been a progressive force for the most part. And so, but regardless of how it's been used, it's, generally speaking, it's a really great thing in the modern world that we say that individuals are responsible for their actions. You're not born guilty, because, as it says in the Old Testament, the sins of the father shall pass down to the sons unto the seventh generation. So the idea that somehow people are, this very Old Testament idea that people are born guilty, and you get the sense in Between the World and Me that white babies in America are born guilty. Like, they are born tainted with the original sin of racism. They're right. And this was how, for a long time, right, in Christian culture, especially in Catholicism, the way they justified how babies that had not been baptized were going to go to hell for the longest time is they said, well, they're born guilty because of original sin. So that's because the question arose immediately. People said, well, how can a baby that's done nothing be guilty and go
so that was the
eternal damnation, right?
Argument.
They said, well, because they're born guilty because of original sin. Yeah. So in Coates's account, there's this powerful metaphysical force called, racism, and it's just
it infuses
every interaction. Everything. Nobody can transcend it. Nobody can get past it.
It's a very pessimistic vision.
It is. It is. And it's also, the funny thing about it is that Coates, which is interesting for an activist, like because very often, even people like Barack Obama, who maybe don't really wear their faith on their sleeve, they've very much aligned themselves with the Black church in the United States because they've recognized that it's a really important institution and has been involved in a lot of social change and civil rights movement and all these things. But Coates very explicitly says in Between the World and Me that he's an atheist and that he thinks religion is bullshit and he doesn't subscribe to any of this stuff. And yet he's written this incredibly religious book.
Yeah.
It's a very, very biblical Old Testament book in its theology. And there's been like some people that actually called him out on that, right?
Yeah, I think I've seen that.
And Cornel West actually criticized him rather savagely and said that he doesn't realize that this view that he has. I mean, actually, Cornel West's criticism was very similar to yours. He said you have to appeal to a common humanity, to a common we are all.
It's more of a class-based.
He says we have to think about people as like we're all children of God. You have to think in terms of the oppressed versus the oppressors, almost kind of a quasi-Marxist view. And we have to think of the fact that we're all Americans and we're in this. So there's various ways that we can find common ground and use that as a way to move forward a progressive agenda. But your vision of things is nothing but a dead end. It leads nowhere. There's nowhere. I would say there is one way to go from Coates' vision.
In terms of reparations?
No, I think the only way to go other than a dead end from his vision is armed conflict where you take up weapons and you have like
they're 13% of the population in the United States. Yeah. It's not a great idea.
No, it's not a very good idea. But I think this is, to come back to one of our earlier points we were talking about, this is something that I think a lot of people who speak in this kind of
apocalyptic.
I don't think they've faced up to what possibilities that leaves on the table. Right?
The logical.
Yeah, the only possibilities that are left on the table are that somehow the majority is going to just decide they completely agree with your analysis and give you everything you want out of the goodness of their hearts, right? I guess that's one thing that's potentially not very likely. And the second one is armed resistance, that you have some sort of a revolution and you like an armed conflict where lots and lots of people die and it's terrible. But there's not really anything left on the table when you go there. But anyway, I thank you very, very much for
it was my pleasure. It was
coming
fun
to talk about this, and definitely want to see you again in the future.
Well, I'm sure we'll cross paths now that we're going to recognize each other.
Thank you.
It was my pleasure.